Well, I think we'll get started. This is an evening in English, so there's no French translation of Iain's talk. It's my very great pleasure to welcome Iain McGilchrist to Sciences Po. I think for the first time that he's spoken in France since the publication of The Master and His Emissary.
That's right.
That's right. So, une première à Sciences Po, and that's very important, and it's an illustration of the very broad range of speakers that Sciences Po welcomes every week and most weeks of the academic year. And I'm delighted to see that so many people have come to listen to him, because it's a very important message, and he'll be able to give more of that message than I would ever be able to hope to explain. So my introduction is going to be very brief. Probably, given the inquiries that I've been receiving over the last few months about this and a related event tomorrow, I almost believe that Iain McGilchrist doesn't need any introduction. His passionately interested readers tell me that they're great fans and that they love the book and so on. And so, well, I think I'll give an introduction anyway, because that's my task. Iain is a psychiatrist and the author of this impressively large and long book, The Master and His Emissary, The Divided Brain and the Making of the Western World. That much you know. And if you've so much as Googled him, you may have come across quite a large number of public talks given in various parts of the world, including an extraordinary condensation of a talk given at the Royal Society of Arts, which lasts, in the version on YouTube, 11 minutes and 3/4, I think, something like that, 11 minutes and 44 seconds or something like that, and which gives you, in a very small compass, the condensate of his book. He was not always a psychiatrist, and that's perhaps the first thing to say about Iain. He was originally a literary scholar. He studied English at Oxford. He did rather well. He was awarded a fellowship at All Souls, which gives you the luxury of 7 years where you can do more or less what you want, including nothing. And he began by studying literary criticism in detail and found it rather wanting, and decided that he would rather do something else. And in particular, and he'll correct me if I'm wrong about this, I think he discovered that literary criticism was somewhat destructive, and what he wanted to do was to understand why. He began by looking at the philosophy of mind, and in particular the famous mind-body problem, which has been with us since Descartes, and didn't make much progress, I think, with the various Anglophone versions of that problem, and turned instead shortly to phenomenology. But eventually threw in the academic towel, trained as a doctor, trained in medicine, became a psychiatrist, and over a very long period of time pursued a kind of double life, if I understand this correctly, of medical practice, treating people with psychiatric and neuroses and psychoses, and writing and researching the book, which took him 20 years. It was published in 2008 or 9. A new version was published this year. It's a remarkable book. It's had a huge effect on the public all over the world. And it's a particularly important book for the understanding of the contemporary world. He's going to be saying more about this today. For philosophical reasons, and I'm by training a philosopher, it interests me greatly because it provides us with a very different view of the soul from anything that people have floated as a hypothesis for explaining human thinking since Plato. Instead of giving us a unified soul, unified by reason, it provides us with a dual picture of the soul, which needs complementarity but doesn't always achieve it. I think the project, and I think anybody who's read the book thinks that the project is enormously, absurdly ambitious. And perhaps what's interesting is that in order to achieve that ambition, it was necessary, no doubt, that somebody master several different disciplines and preferably very different disciplines at once, in order to understand what's going on in our thinking today that makes the world such a complicated, painful, and intractably incurable situation which we're living at the moment. So I'll hand over the microphone, he's got his own, to Iain, and allow him to explain the divided brain and its human meaning. He himself will explain in what way his talk is perhaps slightly different from the one that was originally planned, but I think we're going to benefit from that. Thank you, Iain.
Thank you very much. Alors, bonsoir, messieurs, dames. Je m'excuse que je ne vous parlerai pas en français. Je pense que vous me comprendrez mieux si je parle en anglais. Et ce chaleur accablante, comme une chaleur d'Arabie. Je ferai un striptease pour vous. Comme, I don't think it'll give much pleasure. Anyway, yes, I'm here really to talk about the book, The Master and His Emissary, and the thesis of it, and why I wrote it, and why I think it has meaning for all of us. There has been... Oops, no, that's not how you get to the next slide, is it?
Is this a row?
No, it's going up and down instead of moving on to the next slide. The physicist Paul Dirac was famous because whenever he went into the laboratory, all the machines stopped working. And
yeah. Okay.
That's what I would... Anyway, and I'm afraid I have the same effect on technology. It's a kind of love-hate relationship we have. But in over history, the twofold nature of the human being has been often commented on. Here is your own countryman Pascal. The twofold nature of man is so evident that some have thought that we had two souls. And there are similar comments by other philosophers, including Kant, Goethe, Max Scheler, and Bergson. And so a number of people have noted this curious double nature of the human being over the years. And this chimes with something to do, I believe, with the structure of what underlies our mind, namely the human brain. When I was in medical school, it was never commented on that the brain is a divided structure. I mean, there it was divided, but nobody said, why is this entity that exists only to make connections? Why does it have a whopping great divide down the middle? And here you see this rather lugubrious-looking gentleman, not too happy at all about having his meninges peeled back, but here you see the structure of the brain, and this will be a success for technology if we get this to work. Let me see. You can see in the middle there, this area, the left hemisphere has been pulled back to reveal the so-called corpus callosum, which connects the two hemispheres. Now, although it contains a very large number of fibers, only about 2% of the neurons in the brain connect across the corpus callosum. So there's a couple of interesting puzzles. And, oh yes, this is a view of the brain looking from below. So it's as though you were looking up your own spinal column at the base of the brain. Somebody once said to me, what's that interesting white button in the middle of the brain? But it's not a white button, that's the top of the brain stem. And in medical school, it was pointed out that there was an enlargement here towards the back on the the left. Due to a helpful convention of neuroanatomy, the left is on the right and the right is on the left. It makes it easier for you to understand. And this area here, it was noted, was expanded. You can see it's broader here than on the right, and that it juts somewhat back, so as though there's been an enlargement here. And that was always said to be because of language. And that's actually not true, because, for example, gorillas, bonobos, chimpanzees also have this expansion, but they don't have language. But what was never mentioned was that this area up here is the most asymmetrical part of the whole human brain. It's the right frontal cortex. Can you see it's much broader than on the left? And again, it juts forward and slightly over the midline, as though someone had got hold of the brain from below and given it a sharp twist clockwise, as a result of which it's called Yakovlevian talk, Yakovlevian because Yakovlev first described it. Now, what's that about? Because if you wanted just to create more brain, as we got apparently, I'm told, more advanced, you would have just expanded the brain symmetrically. The box in which the brain is contained, the human skull, is symmetrical, but the brain inside it is not. So it's as though it's quite important that some bits are expanded on one side and some bits are expanded on the other. Why is that? Oh, no. And then there is a third interesting point. Here we are looking at a slice through the brain, a sagittal slice. So you're looking from the side as though you'd cut the brain from the front to the back. And on the left you see the brain of a dog, and on the right you see a human brain. Now the thing that is of fascination to me is this area here is the corpus callosum. That is the area that connects the two hemispheres. But if you look at it, it's not very different in size from the human one when you consider the enormous expansion of the human cortex in relation to that of the dog. So there are three immediate puzzles that were, to me, fascinating when I studied medicine. Why is the brain divided at all? Why is it asymmetrical? And why is the corpus callosum actually getting smaller in relation to the size of the brain rather than larger over human history? And just to add to the mystery, most of the traffic across the corpus callosum has an inhibitory effect rather than a permissive effect. A lot of the fibers that cross the corpus callosum for the neuroscientists here are, of course, glutamatergic, they're excitatory, but they, for a very large part of them, are but on inhibitory, GABAergic neurons, and so the overall effect is to say, keep out of this, I'm dealing with it. So there's an interesting thing going on about the relationships between the hemispheres. Now, I thought this was something worth looking at, and I'm glad to say that I'm not alone. At the top is probably one of the most distinguished living British psychiatrists and neuroresearchers, Tim Crowe, saying, except in the light of lateralization, nothing in human psychology or psychiatry makes any sense. And below that is Ono Güntürkün at Bochum in Germany, who won the Gottfried Wilhelm Leibniz Prize, which is Germany's most prestigious prize for science, for his work on lateralization in the brain. And he says, hemispheric asymmetries pervade practically all major neural systems of the human brain. There's hardly any perceptual, cognitive, or motor system that is not affected by left-right differences of at least some of its components. So those are two enormously distinguished figures in their field, unimpeachably worth listening to, who clearly believe, as I do, that there is something here. So when you hear people say, asymmetries of the brain, left-right difference, doesn't mean anything, it's all pop psychology, tell them they just don't know enough yet. Now let me go on. And there's a reason why people take this attitude, because you can find on the internet a number of helpful charts telling you what the difference between the right and left hemispheres are. I've taken one of the better ones, actually, off the internet, and I've retitled it Right and Wrong, because with one exception, everything on this list is wrong. And I will offer a free pizza to anyone who can spot the one that is right. Also, because I'm a Scot and rather mean, I'm going to move on before you win the free pizza. Now, I was advised very strongly by my seniors, don't go near this topic. It's career death. Don't talk about hemisphere differences. And that's because all kinds of rather vulgar things had happened. Volvo had produced a car for your right brain. And of course, once that sort of thing happens, neuroscientists, rather proud people, they go, oh, no, we don't have anything to do with that. But that didn't seem to me quite good enough. And I spent 20 years basically researching, and it issued in this book, The Master and His Emissary, published by Yale in 2009. And as Ronan was saying, published this year with a new introduction by me. Thank you. I didn't pay this gentleman. In fact, I don't even know who this gentleman is, but he's very kind anyway. Yes, by an extraordinary coincidence, he happens to have a copy of the book here. But it costs about 10 euros, and it'll probably be the best purchase you ever make. So how did I come to get more interested in this? Well, to go back a bit, as you heard, I started work in the field of English literature, and this also was a bit of a sideways step, because I went up to Oxford to study philosophy and theology, because I thought the most interesting parts of philosophy were those that overlapped with theology, and the most interesting parts of theology were those that overlapped with philosophy. And my examiner said, you're far too good to do that. You can't possibly do that. It's not an honours degree. Well, in 1972 in Oxford, philosophy and theology wasn't an honours degree. Nowadays you can get, and this is a genuine fact, you can get an honours degree in Frisbee. But in those days you couldn't get an honours degree in theology and philosophy. So I'd taken the entrance exam. You had to sit an exam in some sort of school subject to get in, and I just happened to choose English. And my examiner said, well, you seem to do this rather well, why don't you come and do that? So I did. And I loved it. But I found there was a curious problem with it. And it's something like this, if I put it very simply. Somebody in the past had written something very beautiful that they thought would have meaning for people who came after them. And its meaning lay in three aspects of it that were particularly important. One was that it wasn't just abstract ideas, but was embodied in the very words of the poem, as music is embodied in the music, and you appreciate music not just with your mind, but with your body, and you appreciate a poem with your body. When you read poetry, your skeletal musculature is reacting to it. You're not aware of that. Your breathing changes, your pulse rate changes, your blood pressure changes, the hair on your skin may stand up, you may have tears in your eyes. This is very embodied. The second thing is that a work of literature is implicit. As soon as you explain it, you ruin it. You know, it's like explaining a joke. Once you've explained it, it's no longer a joke. And poems are like that. Once they've been explained, they're no longer poems. And actually all the really important things in life are like this. Sex is like that. Once it's put in the spotlight, changes its nature. Love is like that. Religion is like that. Art is like that. Humor is like that. And the third thing was that there was something unique about any successful work of art. It couldn't be replaced by anything else. Let me try and think of a French example, perhaps Mallarmé. If Mallarmé had never written, you couldn't have imagined Mallarmé. You could have imagined other poets, but not his particular style. And for me, that was very, very clear that there was something unique. One of my favorite poets in English is Thomas Hardy, who you may know of as a novelist or have heard of as a novelist. He's actually he's a great novelist, but he's a much greater poet. He's one of the greatest poets in the English language. And he's very unique, he's eccentric. I mean, if he hadn't written, there'd be a Hardy-shaped hole in the universe. So to cut a long story short, works of art are embodied, they're implicit, and they're unique. And then in the seminar room, we came along, and what did we do? We disembodied them. We made them explicit, and we generalized and categorized whatever we found. And then we were surprised that we were left with a handful of dust. Now, I left literature not because I don't like literature, but I don't like operating on my friends. In fact, the English poet Ted Hughes read English at Cambridge, and he stopped after having a dream in which a fox came into his room and put its bleeding paw on his essay and said, "Why are you killing us?" So I thought, well, I don't want to be one of the murderers here. But at the same time, something else was very interesting was going on. I was thinking about what is it that's wrong with our approach to literature. And my answer was really that in a way, we divorce the mind and the body. And as Ronan mentioned, I then started going to all the philosophy seminars on the mind-body problem. And I found their approach simply too disembodied. And I wanted to do it in a more embodied way. And what did that mean? It meant studying medicine and seeing at first hand what happens when something goes wrong with somebody's brain or body and it affects their mind and their person. And what goes wrong when something happens to somebody's mind and it issues in problems in the body. At that moment, Oliver Sacks had published his great book, Awakenings, which if you haven't read it, I very strongly recommend, which manages to do something very beautiful, which is to reflect philosophically on the meaning of illness, and yet at the same time go maximally into the unique cases in front of him. Nobody has written better case studies, not even Freud. So I ended up deciding that I would have to study medicine. I was 10 years older than most people when they started medicine, but I thought I have to do it. So I did it. And that took 6 years, and then I studied neurology and neurosurgery a bit, and then I went to the Maudsley Hospital in London, which is a big teaching hospital for psychiatry. And there one day, I was very busy, and no, I wasn't. I was a lazy sod. No, there was a day when somebody was giving a lecture, and I thought, I don't want to be bothered with that. I've had too much to drink. I'm going to have another cup of tea. But in fact, I went to this lecture. What was this lecture called? It was called The Right Cerebral Hemisphere and Psychiatric Disorders. And it was by an English author called John Cutting, who is not very well known, but I think is the most interesting Anglophone psychiatrist still living, because he's philosophically very astute. And he had just published a book with Oxford University Press called The Right Cerebral Hemisphere and Psychiatric Disorders. Now that fascinated me, because in medical school, nobody really talked much about the right hemisphere. All the important stuff like language and moving the right hand was all done by the left hemisphere. And you got the vague impression that the right hemisphere was just there as a kind of stuffing to stop the left hemisphere falling over too much. So it was fascinating to hear that somebody was going to talk about the consequences of right cerebral hemisphere damage. And he had sat at the bedside of patients for 20 years who had had right cerebral hemisphere strokes or tumors and asked them about their reality. Now, it may surprise you to know that it's harder to rehabilitate a person who has a lesion in their right hemisphere than in their left. After a lesion in the left hemisphere, people mostly are, for a while at any rate, unable to speak or use language, and they have difficulty using their right hand. Pretty devastating stuff. But actually, once they're able to master that, nothing much in the world has changed. Because understanding the world and the meaning of the world is not something the left hemisphere is involved in. It's involved in doing something else, which is manipulating the world. And it's the right hemisphere that understands the meaning of the world. And John had found that extraordinary distortions happened to reality when people had damage to the right hemisphere that didn't happen when they had damage to the left. And I couldn't believe my ears, because what I heard him say in this lecture was three things that struck me. One was that the right hemisphere is more in touch with the body than the left. In other words, it has more profuse connections with the cingulate cortex, with the the hypothalamic pituitary adrenal axis, which governs the autonomic system of the body. It contains the body image, which is not just a visual image, but a multimodal image of the body. Number two, the right hemisphere alone seems to understand implicit meaning. It understands metaphor. It understands irony. It understands humor, whereas the left hemisphere takes everything literally. And thirdly, the right hemisphere is interested in the unique case. The left hemisphere doesn't notice uniqueness because its main job is categorizing. Now, those were the three things that I'd noticed that we were getting wrong when we approached a work of art. And I suddenly had a light bulb moment. The reason I'd found it so hard to explain what was wrong was that it was the right hemisphere that understood what was wrong, but the left hemisphere that controlled language and the speech. And I just found that the English language, at any rate, was very bad at explaining what I meant. In fact, I had a Chinese colleague, I explained what I was doing. He said, now the Chinese have words for all the things you're saying, but most Western languages don't. So that was fascinating. I went up to John after the lecture, talked to him and said, I want to talk to you about this. I lent him a copy of my book, which was called Against Criticism, which was about what's wrong with literary criticism in the academic world. And we then did research together on lateralization of the brain. I went to Johns Hopkins and researched on asymmetry in the brain in people with schizophrenia. The brain, as I have explained, is normally asymmetrical, but in people with schizophrenia, often the asymmetry is either completely lacking or reversed, and this seems to be linked with the deficits in schizophrenia. So that's how I got into it, and I spent 20 years studying the literature and finding out more about it, and it's that I'm going to now talk about. Now this, of course, is a brain scan, and once you put on a brain scan, your IQ goes up by about 20 points. Except that this isn't a brain scan. Hands up those who spotted it wasn't a brain scan. It is actually a scan of the oldest living creature. It's called Nematostella vectensis. It's 700 million years old, and it lives off the Isle of Wight, which is off the south coast of England, where most of the people are about 700 million years old. And it's the interesting thing about this is the very oldest neural network. The striptease is now beginning. This is the very oldest neural network that we know of. It is the origin of the neural networks. The person who discovered it in Heidelberg explains that this is the most primitive. And the interesting thing about it is you can see that this is the axis from front to back, right? And so you can see that on left and right, the neuronal structures are different. They engage differently with binding chemicals. So already in the very earliest stages of the development of a neural network, there are asymmetries. Now, in fact, there are asymmetries not just in the human brain, but in every brain, in the brains of mammals, the brains of birds, the brains of reptiles, amphibians, in slugs, in nematode worms, in insects, and even going back in history, we can see in trilobites, from the fossils, that they were asymmetrical in important ways in their activity. We know that because they have more bytes on one side statistically than on the other. And that actually is quite relevant to what the difference between the two halves of the nervous system are and what they're in existence for. Because there is an answer to the question why this is happening, and I think it's fascinating. It's that every creature has to learn how to solve a problem, which is how to eat and stay alive. And the that doesn't sound like much of a problem in Paris, after all, these days. But it is a problem for most creatures, because if you are going to eat and look after yourself, like catch a seed on a background of grit and pebbles before another bird does, or latch onto a rabbit, or pick up a twig to build a nest, anything in which you are just doing the basics of living and manipulating the environment, you need very, very narrowly focused, extremely sharp, targeted attention to a detail. But if that's the only attention you pay, you will become someone else's lunch while you're getting yours, because you need to have the exact opposite at the same time. You need to have broad, open, sustained, vigilant attention to the whole picture. And the only way you can do that, since attention is simply the way in which you dispose your consciousness, is to have two areas of consciousness. And so nature has solved this problem, if you like, by giving all creatures these two neuronal alternatives to attend to the world in two different ways. Now, this is actually where I live. You can see my house, and behind it you can see a mountain. And that mountain, this is on the Isle of Skye, by the way. It's already overrun with tourists, so don't go there. But this mountain is called Talisker, and the reason it's called Talisker is that that is the Norse word for sloping rock. So what this means is we know that 1,000 years ago, the Norsemen coming down to the west coast of Scotland used this rock as a landmark from the sea. So to them, what did this mountain mean? It meant safety or danger, because this is a dangerous bay in which you could be shipwrecked. We also know that 1,000 years before them, there were Picts living there, because we can see the remains of their dwellings, which are called brochs. And to them, the mountain meant shelter, and it also meant the home of the gods. And then in the 18th century, people started going there to look at the geology, because it is an extraordinary fine example of columnar basalt. And in the 19th century, people went there to paint and draw, because it has a many-textured, many-coloured shape and form of some beauty. To a developer, what does this mountain mean? It means dollars. To a physicist, what does it mean? It means 99.99% space. And we don't really know what the other 0.01% is. So these are all ways of attending to this mountain, and they produce completely different results. Which of these is the real mountain? There isn't a real mountain, because they're all aspects of reality. But what it tells you is how you attend changes what exists. You're not aware that your attention is being alternated in this way between the broad picture and the narrow picture and so on, because it's all done at a level below consciousness. This red dot is, well, it's rather too large for its purpose, but it's so that you can see where it is. This is the midbrain, and in the tectum of the midbrain there is a meta-control center which directs attention to right and left hemisphere at a millisecond to millisecond level. And that all, of course, goes on outside of your awareness, because if you were aware of it, you wouldn't be able to get anything done. Now, the problem here is that we try to build up a picture of the world. The striptease advances. Don't worry, I do have inhibitions. So there is a problem about how you find out about reality. You can't actually attend in one way first and go, now I've got something definite to build on, and I do a bit more and I build on that and build on that, because it is a hermeneutic circle. You have to jump in to this uncertain state of things out there at some point. And what you find on that first jump will influence what you find on your second visit. And so what you begin to find builds a kind of relatively fossilized version of the world according to that way of looking at it. And it's like this picture of Escher's hands, that each gives rise to the other. And it's very important to remember that we therefore need to be alternating our way of thinking, not getting stuck in one particular paradigm, as I believe in the modern West we have. So according to the left hemisphere, life is to do with getting things. It's the left hemisphere that controls the right hand with which I grab things and grasp them. And in English we say, I've grasped it. So you've got an idea, you've pinned it down. And after all, the roots of comprendre, from comprehendere, are to grasp something. And it's the same in German, begreifen, etc. So this is the right hemisphere. It controls vision, which enables you to go to a target linearly, directly, and get it. So A, if you like, leads to B. That's the kind of system it understands. But in reality, it's not like that. And this is what the right hemisphere sees, which is a picture in which A doesn't exactly lead to B. And it's also living and changing and developing and massively interconnected. Now, people may say, well, it's all very gross of you to be talking about a hemisphere compared with another hemisphere. Because after all, it's all about the little modules and units within the hemispheres. That is certainly part of the truth. But it's also true that, as we now know, most activity in the brain is to do with distributed networks, which are very widely distributed often. And the hemispheres are much, much more intraconnected within themselves than they are interconnected between one another by a factor of about 100. So here you see two of the sort of information superhighways in the brain, the superior longitudinal fasciculus and the uncinate fasciculus, which draw together areas of heteromodal association cortex and help us make sense of experience. And I am concerned not with the fact that the two hemispheres have a lot in common. They do. But it's the things that they have different that are important. You know, if you're going to buy a car, you might say, well, there's nothing to choose. Every car has four wheels, it's got an engine, it's got doors. You know, what's the difference? Well, quite a lot, actually. And, you know, if I were to compare Einstein with Donald Trump, you might say, well, they're practically the same. You know, they've got a brain, I think so anyway, and they've got all this other stuff. You know, there's no difference, but sometimes it's the differences that really matter. And so, yes, the hemispheres overlap a lot in what they do, but I am interested in the ways in which they're different. And the way in which we had got it wrong in the past was because we asked the wrong question. We asked the question you'd ask of a machine, what does it do? And in the old days, they had this sort of idea that the left hemisphere did reason and language, and the right hemisphere did pictures and emotions. It was sort of given to painting pictures and slightly artistic temperament. And, you know. But this, of course, turned out to be wrong, because both hemispheres are involved in everything that we do. Everything. So they're both involved in reason, both involved in language, both involved in emotion, both involved in visuospatial things, but just in different ways. Now, if we'd thought of the brain not as a machine, but as part of a person, which it manifestly is, we'd have asked a more personal question. What's it like? In what way does it go about doing this task? To what end? With what values? And if you ask those questions, you find interestingly different answers. And I'm going to do something rather gross, which is to summarize 20 years of research, 600 pages of finely nuanced text, and 2,500 pieces of research paper, and give you a little set of little bullet points that you can take home with you. So don't take them too seriously. But roughly speaking, these are kind of important. And in each case, I've tried to put what the left hemisphere does on the left and what the right hemisphere does comparatively on the right. So the left hemisphere is more at home with what is known to it. After all, it's the one that is making decisions about action. it's a rabbit, I get it. It's no good going, sort of, is it a rabbit or is it a penguin? I don't know. I mean, you'll starve to death. So things need to be known to the left hemisphere, but you also need a hemisphere that is willing to say, it might not be that, actually. It might be something else. And it is the one that takes in new experience. Now, Elkin and Goldberg, a famous American neuroscientist, and colleagues have researched this over 10 years, published research, showing that every kind of new experience is first dealt with by the right hemisphere. And once it becomes, as we say in English, able to be pigeonholed, categorized, put into a box, then it goes to the left hemisphere, which is more comfortable with what it knows. Then the left hemisphere is more keen on certainty. It likes black and white. It likes, it's either this or it's that. It doesn't like possibility. And if you like, a lot of philosophy has been about whether we should close down to certainty or open up to possibility. And the left hemisphere tends to close down to certainty, and the right hemisphere to open up to possibility. So when, in this famous image, those of you who like Wittgenstein will know it, of the duck rabbit, actually taken from a children's comic in Victorian England in the 1890s, the right hemisphere is happy with the idea that this is possibly a duck, possibly a rabbit, possibly both. The left hemisphere is meanwhile saying, what the hell are you talking about? Make up your mind. Is it a duck or is it a rabbit? This is a very profound thing about which I've almost finished writing a 1,200-page book, which is about the importance of flow. And I'm not even going to begin to explain why that's important, but I'm just going to advert to the fact that the left hemisphere sees things frozen, fixed, whereas the right hemisphere sees them constantly changing. And this is sort of the difference between movement, as it is in the world, and the still frames of a cinefilm or the digitalization of motion. And pleasingly for me, you even have the word in French for a snapshot, a cliché, which for us means something that's already dead. So we need both those things. And sometimes when the right hemisphere is damaged, you get a condition called either achinotopsia or palinopsia, which results in this kind of juddering motion because it's constantly fixing its attention. Then there is the distinction, a hugely important distinction, between the parts and the whole, to which really, if you like, I've devoted most of my philosophical life. The difference between the meaning of a gestalt and the meaning of the parts of it. The left hemisphere sees the body as an arm, an ear, a leg, a mouth, a nose. The right hemisphere sees the whole and where the parts go. This picture, who has seen this picture before? Not too many. Does anyone not know what on earth's going on in this picture? I won't ask you to come up, but I think it's rather hard at first sight. But let me just explain. It is a Dalmatian dog sniffing the ground in the shade of a tree. And I'll just come over for a moment. So here is the dog's snout. It's good. Here is its ear. Here is its back, tail, hind legs, front legs, and it's sniffing the ground where two paths cross in the shade of a tree. Now, there is no way that you can look at that and go, I think we've got a bit of shade there, and I think we've got a bit of path there and a bit of a dog there. You have to see the whole and work towards the parts. Now, actually, in life, that is what you do. You don't go into your living room at home and go, oh, a chair, a light, a TV set. My living room. You know exactly what you're dealing with, and then your attention is caught by something that is important. And that means that when people look at these figures, normally they see an H and a 4 first before they see E's and H's. That's called the hierarchy of attention. And there's one exception to that, which is in schizophrenia, which simulates right hemisphere dysfunction. So if you saw the E's and the H's first, come and see me afterwards. No, just to reassure you, I'm a doctor, I will reassure you. No, there are many other reasons why you might have seen the E's and the H's first. And these are all drawn by people with right hemisphere deficits or tumours. On the left, you see a man or person. In the middle, you see a bicycle, in which, interestingly, the wheels are smaller than the pedals and above the pedals, so the sense of the whole shape has been lost. And on the right, you have a house. And something rather interesting happens when you have a right hemisphere stroke. And that's because the right hemisphere stroke is taking in, the right hemisphere is taking in the whole of reality. So when you are functioning with your right hemisphere, you see the whole picture. But when you're using only your left hemisphere, you only see the right half of the world. That's because the left hemisphere is not really interested in understanding the whole world. It's only interested in the bit in which it can manipulate things, grab things, move things, make things, which is this half of reality. And this means that patients who have right hemisphere stroke sometimes deny the existence of the left half of space. They'll read only the right side of a book. They'll talk to people only if they're on the right. This is not because there's anything wrong with their sight or their hearing. All that's working fine. They just don't attend. And they don't believe there is a left side of their body. They can feel it, but they just don't believe it's there, so they will forget to dress it, forget to shave it. And this is a still frame taken from the cartoon animate, which Ronan was describing. If you want to see it, not now, please, Google or put into YouTube RSA, the Royal Society of Arts, McGilchrist, and animate, and it'll come up. So the next thing is that the left hemisphere understands the explicit. It doesn't really understand the implicit. So, you know, if I say, it's hot in here today, you, using your right hemisphere, know, yes, we really ought to open a door or turn the heating down or something. But the left hemisphere is kind of puzzled by my offering this unneeded meteorological information. It doesn't understand the implied meaning. And as I say, most of what we do when we communicate is implicit. 95% of all our communication is not actually explicit. It's in what we don't say, it's in how we say things, how we phrase them, the tone of voice we use, the facial expression, the body language. All of that, the right hemisphere understands. The left hemisphere relatively doesn't. Then there is the problem of the abstract versus the contextual. So the left hemisphere takes things out of context. Now, context is vitally important. John Dewey, one of the greatest philosophers who ever lived, said the big problem for philosophers is that they so often take things out of context. And when you take something out of context, it changes its nature. Everything important to you is denatured when it's taken out of context and put under a microscope or a spotlight. And we don't remember that enough. Context is amusing because context can literally reverse the meaning of something. Let me give you an example. In America, there are 4 sizes of cereal packets. There's one called jumbo, and that means very large. And then there's one called economy, which means large. Then there's one called family, which means medium. And finally, there's one called large, which means small. So you really need to pay attention to context. Then there is the distinction between the general and the unique. The left hemisphere understands more the general case. It lumps things together and sees the gross category. It doesn't see the unique, which is really rather more important. And there are some really rather moving stories of people who had right hemisphere strokes. One was a farmer who knew every one of his cows by name. Afterwards, he could barely tell the difference between a cow and a horse. And there was another woman in Switzerland who'd made it her job over her life, to get to know all the birds of Switzerland. And after a right hemisphere stroke, she said, all the birds look the same. So here we have the right hemisphere sort of seeing, as it were, the individuals, Sarah and Mark, the left hemisphere seeing them in categories: social partner, food. The left hemisphere is interested in how much, the right hemisphere more in of what sort, something that might ring a bell with you these days when discussions of everything seem to devolve on how much of something there is rather than of what quality it might be. The left hemisphere tends to be fixed on the inanimate. Tools and machines code in the left hemisphere only. This is so strong that even left-handers who are using their right hemisphere in daily life to control their left hand and therefore to use tools and machines, they still code tools and machines usually in the left hemisphere. And this is another distinction. The left hemisphere is unreasonably optimistic. The left hemisphere is slightly pessimistic, but it's more realistic. And there's a test that you have to do before you do neurosurgery in which you can anesthetize one half of the brain at a time. And some clever psychologists thought, well, while we've got just one half of the person, let's ask that one half some questions about itself. And so they gave them personality inventories to fill out, and they gave the same inventories to family and friends. And when they compared them, they found that the left hemisphere had a very high opinion of itself and of its virtues, whereas the right hemisphere seemed to be a little bit down on itself, unnecessarily harsh on itself. And this is very dramatic. So any here are medics? Anybody who's a medic? Yeah. So you will have seen, all medics will have seen this, it's a very common thing. Somebody has a right hemisphere stroke, they come into hospital overnight, on the ward round in the morning you go and visit them. And you say, how are you feeling? And they say, fine, thank you. And you go, oh, that's good. Any problems? No. Any problems, for example, moving your left hand? Arm? No. Well, would you mind just showing me? And then they go, there, you see. And you say, well, I didn't see anything move, you see. Did you? No, we didn't see anything move. And then if you bring it round in front of them and say, move that, they go, oh, that's not my arm, that belongs to the bloke in the next bed. So these are not mad people, these are people in denial. Nothing is wrong with the person when the left hemisphere is in control. And finally, the most important distinction, which is that between what is present, as Heidegger said, what presence is to us, and what is represented, i.e. literally no longer present, but present later, something that is not any longer real and vivid and present for us. This is the distinction between the map and a territory. The map is much, much simpler than the territory, and its value lies in the fact that it is simple. It wouldn't be a better map if it had all the detail about everything in it. But you can't live in the map. You mustn't mistake the real world for what the map says. You must actually visit the real world and try to live there. Now, here's a little bit of lighter entertainment. Here are some pictures drawn by people in 3 different states. On the left, the brain is intact. In the middle, the left hemisphere alone is drawing, the right hemisphere has been suppressed. And 2 things have happened. First of all, you notice rather nicely that the left half of the tree has been completely neglected. Only the right half of the tree is there. And the other thing is, it's become a purely symbolic tree. It is no longer like a living tree. But the tree on the right, the one drawn by the right hemisphere, still has the structure and flowing form of a tree. The same thing is true of flowers here. In the middle you see it reduced to a geometric structure or symbol. The same thing here with desk, really just showing you that depth, which is something I haven't got time to go into right now unless somebody wants to ask me a question about it, but the 3-dimensional nature of the world is perceived by the right hemisphere. It sees that desk in perspective, whereas the left hemisphere in the middle column tends to flatten it out. And here, these are all done by people using only the left hemisphere. I'll just draw your attention first to the column on the left, which shows a cube flattened out in the way that a child might draw it, so that you see all the sides. And the 4th column along is a person, reduced to a couple of rhomboids or a kind of stick. This is what happens to humanity when the left hemisphere is in control. Now, the way we attend changes what happens and how we relate to the world. The word attend comes from Latin ad tendere, which means to reach out a hand to something. Now, usually, of course, the left hemisphere will tell you when you reach out a hand, it's to get something. That's what it does. Got that one, I'm doing rather well. But there is something else you can do with your hand. You can reach it out to help, to make contact, to explore the world, and even to bring something to life. And here you see that symbolized in two famous pictures. You won't need an introduction to the earlier one, but this is from the Paraclesion of the St. Saviour Hora Church in Istanbul. Do visit it if you're ever there. Now, nowadays, I think something strange has happened. The left hemisphere is interested in what goes on inside a scheme of things that it has. So here I want to, this is a little bit difficult, so if you've been napping peacefully, wake up and have a little listen to what I'm about to say. A very, very nice piece of research was done in which people were asked to evaluate a series of propositions leading to a conclusion. And so the famous example of this is all men are mortal, Socrates is a man, therefore Socrates is mortal. But these all had a little bit of a twist. One of the two premises that lead to the conclusion was wrong. And so they asked people in three conditions, in the normal state, with the left hemisphere only and with the right hemisphere only, to answer the question, were these true? So the example I'm going to give is the one that they used. They used 10 of them, but one was all monkeys climb trees. Well, this is not very controversial. The porcupine is a monkey. That is slightly more controversial. And the conclusion, porcupines climb trees. Well, unfortunately, actually, some porcupines, very annoyingly, do climb trees. But these people doing the experiment, neither the people who set it nor the people who did it knew that. This was going on in Russia in the 1990s. They knew nothing. So anyway, they asked them, so is this true? Now, in the normal state, they said, well, no, not really, because the porcupine's not a monkey. In the left hemisphere state, the same people, not different people, the very same people on a different day, said, yes, it's true. Practically all of them said it's true. Then they asked, why? Don't you know the porcupine's not a monkey? They said, yeah, but that's what it says on this piece of paper. In other words, the internal structure trumped reality. Sorry to use that terrible verb. Trumped reality. When the right hemisphere was asked, it said, well, of course not, because the porcupine's nothing like a monkey. And they did this many times over, and it always led to, roughly speaking, this result. Now, this rings bells for me, because we live in a world in which, as it were, it's what's on this piece of paper that matters, not what's actually happening out in the real world. So the left hemisphere is always examining, is this consistent within my system of what I know? Not, here's something new I actually have to come to terms with, and might actually have to shift my paradigm. Now, in this world in which we live, we've lost the reasons that we would have known that we're living in a hall of mirrors. The sorts of things that used to tell us that there's more to life than what goes on inside our system of thinking were things like the natural world. And until the beginning of this century, 95% of humanity, or perhaps even more, lived surrounded by the natural world. Now it might be hardly even half. Then there is a living culture, which embodies a certain kind of traditional wisdom, which is embodied in works of art and in the sayings and the way of thinking of a people. That has all been, for various reasons, fragmented or lost. Then there is the body, which also stands rather pleasantly over against our ideas. We can have lots of ideas that we would like to have about reality, but the body is something that we still have to reckon with. The body is something very real. We are as much body as we're anything else as human beings. And then there is art, which, forgive me, in my lifetime seems to have become over-abstract, over-conceptual, over-clever, rather than being devastatingly metaphorically powerful in ways that defy analysis. And we seem to have lost the power of religion, except in its most debased and perverted form of fundamentalism. either in fundamental Christianity, fundamentalist Christianity, fundamentalist Islam, fundamentalist anything, fundamentalist atheism. The nuances have been lost, and the sense of something beyond has been lost. So that, as it were, we live in a world in which reality is just painted on the screen, and behind it there is nothing. So we live in a world in which signs seem simply to refer to one another. There's no reality beyond the sign. That's a perfectly genuine photograph. It hasn't been photoshopped. Now, I'm going to end by just commenting on what it would be like if we lived in a left hemisphere world. I believe what has happened is not that somehow our brains have evolved very quickly over a few hundred years into something else. Of course they haven't. They will be slightly different because everything you do modifies your brain, the structure and function of it. The brain is plastic. It's in dialogue with the environment. The environment's affected by the brain's affected by the environment. But gross structural changes aren't happening. And the analogy I would like to make is that it's more like this. You get a radio set, and you're terribly pleased with it. And you listen to, I don't know what the current popular channels are in France, but you find 2 or 3 that you really enjoy, and you listen to those. And then after a while, you find yourself settling into just listening to one channel all the time. Now, that changes what you're picking up. But the radio set hasn't changed at all. It's not the hardware, it's how you're using it. Do you get my meaning? Now, if that is happening, we're just listening to the paradigm of the left hemisphere, that things are fragmented, they're fixed, they're mechanical, they're reductionist, they only achieve wholeness by being put together mechanically by us. What would the world look like? Well, it would look something like this. There'd be loss of the broader picture, of course. Knowledge would become replaced by information, tokens or representations, by algorithms, sheets of paper, procedures, things like skill and judgment, which are dependent on living a life and becoming wise, would be much too human, difficult to quantify, and therefore would be neglected altogether. They wouldn't fit into the form you have to return to management. There'd be simultaneous abstraction and reification, because the left hemisphere doesn't understand that matter and spirit are fused. We are amphibian creatures, and the left hemisphere can't cope, if you remember, with the duck rabbit. It's got to be one or the other. And so matter becomes lumpen material, just what Heidegger called resource, to be exploited. Whereas our mental lives become somehow curiously rarefied, full of abstractions, and no longer properly embodied in the way that Merleau-Ponty would have wished us to see it. Bureaucracy would have a field day because, according to Peter Berger, a famous sociologist, the key features of bureaucracy are these, and they are all subserved by the left hemisphere more than the right. There'd be a loss of the sense of uniqueness. Things would become members of categories. The quantity would become the only criterion by which we made judgments. Things would become black and white, leading to endless disputes of a fruitless and uneducated kind between hordes of people screaming at one another because they only think any longer in black and white and out of context. Reasonableness would become replaced by rationality. I don't know if there's a distinction in French. This isn't really a hard and fast one in English, but it's one I can make. There is in German, there is in Latin, there is in Greek. In German, for example, there's a distinction between Vernunft and Verstand. Is there an equivalent distinction in French? Rationalité, raison, je ne sais pas. But in any case, reasonableness, which is something in which mechanical reasoning is fused with experience, with emotional understanding, with social understanding. In other words, with a vision of life. And used to be the whole purpose of an education, that would become replaced by compréhension. Okay. Okay, merci bien. there'll be a failure of what we call common sense, which is becoming much less common every day. Systems would become to maximize utility. There'll be a loss of social cohesion. The right frontal lobe of the brain is particularly involved in bonding and social cohesion, and it would not be being as effective as it should be. Things would become rather depersonalized. There'd be a sort of paranoia, lack of trust, need to control everything, because the left hemisphere's purpose is to make things happen, to control things, to get things. And if it can't control things, it gets rather paranoid. And all paranoid psychoses that result from strokes or tumors in the brain, almost all of them, and it is staggeringly nearly all of them, follow on damage to the right hemisphere, not damage to the left hemisphere. Anger and aggression would become the keynotes of public discourse because, get this, the left hemisphere is not unemotional at all, and the most lateralized emotion of all is anger, and it lateralizes to the left hemisphere. We'd be the passive victims of others doing. You know, there's something wrong with my arm? No, it belongs to the man in the next bed. We'd be blaming others for our predicament all the time. Art would become largely conceptual with a lack of sense of depth, distorted or bizarre perspectives. Music would produce a little more than rhythms, and melody and harmony for most of us are dependent on the right hemisphere's perceptions. Language would become diffuse, excessive, and lacking in concrete reference. There'll be a deliberate undercutting of the sense of awe or wonder, which just annoys the left hemisphere. What do you mean you're in awe of something? It just means you don't understand it yet. Tomorrow we'll understand it. That is not knowing what it is you don't know, and not knowing the extent of your ignorance. After all, we can't know how much we don't know unless we're already omniscient. And flow would be reduced to just the sum of an infinite series of pieces. There'd be a discarding of all tacit forms of knowing in favor of the explicit. We'd be entangled in what de Tocqueville already in 1830-something referred to as a network of small, complicated rules. We'd be, as Descartes proudly called himself, a spectator rather than an actor in the theatre of the world, sitting on the sofa with our six-pack of beer, or possibly in your case with a very nice bottle of Burgundy, and watching what's going on the screen. And all this would be accompanied by a dangerously unwarranted optimism. Well, thank God we don't live in that world.
That was excellent and brilliantly concluded. We have some time, a fair amount of time, for questions. I think we have a microphone that can move around a little bit. Where did it go? Oh, it's there, right. So we can use the microphone. So if you want to ask a question, do stand up and try to keep the question relatively short. It's much easier for the respondent to reply to a question which is... so there are several people already. Thank you, Monsieur Gilbert.
Hello, Tariq Aribal. Everything that you explain is related to reality, but what happens if you distort reality? For example, taking drugs, LSD, cocaine, or whatever you want. What happens that does the function remain the same, or what happens then?
It's a good question. Drugs of this kind affect the whole brain. They don't just affect one hemisphere. You say not reality, and I know what you mean, but of course we don't really know exactly what reality is. There's certainly a kind of reality that we must agree amongst ourselves is, generally speaking, the case. But I'm very struck by what happens to psychotic patients who have very unusual experiences. When you first meet a schizophrenic patient who believes something really quite improbable, and they're intelligent people sometimes, you sort of think, well, I can reason with them about that and show them evidence how this can't be the case. Absolutely impossible to do. And the reason is not because they've lost their logical faculty, It's because what they're experiencing is entirely real for them. It's not a kind of misperception. It is how things are. And even when they're well, and you say, do you still believe that there are little green men living in the garden shed or whatever it might be? And they say, well, no. And you say, well, why did you think it then? Well, at the time, I think there were. So, as it were, they don't really recognize that it's not real. But I'm afraid the short answer to your question is it doesn't split up. Drug experiences don't split neatly into right and left. But I do think that what happens is that there is probably a good deal of disinhibition. So all kinds of things that are damping down sensory input are released. And so we are seeing things that otherwise we wouldn't see, and maybe we wouldn't be able to function if we could see those things all the time.
The microphone is making its way.
Thank you. So I think from your Hall of Mirrors list, you kind of were tiptoeing around what has caused kind of us to be more left brain sided. Can't speak. But could you expand on that a little bit more about like what's happened in society that's made us use our left side more, possibly, and then also what the takeaways are more on what we're supposed to do about it?
Oh, okay. You've just blown the next 40 minutes. No, I'll try and be very brief. Yes, well, in the second half of the book, The Master and His Emissary, I look at Western history from the Greeks through the Romans to the Renaissance, then the Reformation, the Enlightenment, Romanticism, the Industrial Revolution, modernism and postmodernism. And that takes a while. But in it, what I do is to outline the ways in which at different periods in history we've had different preponderances of left hemisphere and right hemisphere input. And if I can summarize, 3 times in the West, there have been moments of maximum fertility and fruitfulness of ideas in which civilization thrived. These were, roughly speaking, the 6th century BC in Greece, around the year dot, as we say, in Rome, the end of the Republic and the beginning of the Empire, and then the Renaissance in Italy, France, and so on. So what causes these shifts? I think you would expect the answer to have many factors, not just one. And I'm not saying it happens because of the brain. The brain is just if you like, another way of thinking about what is happening, because what is happening is changing the brain, and the brain is changing what is happening. But certain things you can point to. One is that as a society gets more affluent and overextends itself so that it has an empire of a kind, its relationship with the world changes. So things have to be more rigid, they have to be more hierarchical, they have to be more fixed, they have to be less individual, they have to be more remote. And you see changes in thinking and in art going on in later Greece and in Rome as you get into the 3rd and 4th centuries, in which all the humanity, if you like, has been lost. All the sense of proportion and the beauty has been driven out, and everything is about faceless. You see the marvelous depictions of the human face, living depictions in both Greek and Roman sculpture. They become these staring blank faces, as though we've gone back thousands of years to a much more primitive culture. And I'm afraid that since the Enlightenment, which I have to be very careful what I say in France, because I'm sure you'd rather die than hear l'éclaircissement criticized in any way. But I don't think I'm the first person to have spotted that there's a bit of a problem. If I'd been living at the time, I would have thought this is wonderful. But it's become hubristic. It's become things like Richard Dawkins believing that we can solve everything through science. We can't. We don't know half of what we're dealing with. So it's become a problem. And it's become a problem because it rewards us. It gives us results. So it's made us very powerful. We've got money, we've got goods, we've raped and pillaged across the world, grabbing resources, felling trees, poisoning the oceans in order to have stuff and be comfortable. And that is the left hemisphere's agenda, and it makes you feel good for a while. So it's quite hard to resist. And another thing is that it's very hard to defend the right hemisphere's point of view, as I discovered in writing the book Against Criticism. Defending the left hemisphere's point of view is a piece of cake, because it's very, very simple. It's just only making very simple, elementary, rationalistic statements. But trying to explain that that's not enough is hard. And then you have the fact that we have externalized out there a system that looks like the left hemisphere system. So, as I was saying in that Hall of Mirrors bit, in the past we could look at nature and what it tells us. We could look at the history of our culture. We could look at what physical existence tells us. And we would see that it was different from this theoretical construct. But now when we look out of the window, what do we see? In many parts of the world, we see rigid structures, grid-like structures of cities made of steel and concrete that repel the human. We live our lives in remote communication with a two-dimensional screen. This is all good left hemisphere stuff. So I think those are all partly reasons.
Thank you very much for this insightful talk. I've once heard that the way we humans start interacting with technology and our mobile phones and our computers even more and more every day, do you hear me? That this will alter the brain ultimately. Could this be possible, and if so, how drastic this change might be?
Well, thank you. I think I understood you to say, if this is happening, could it actually alter the structure and function of the brain permanently, as
exactly.
it were? Yes. Well, the answer is yes, over a long enough period of time. It can alter function quite quickly through epigenetic changes. And we used to think that these things would take much longer than we now know they do, because we know lots of ways in which changes can happen faster and can be substantially transmitted from generation to generation. So yes, we are all the time doing things to our brain. I mean, the trouble is that every single thing you do alters your brain. You know, having a cheese sandwich, watching a porn film, you know, it's all altering your brain. So mind what you're doing, because you're making yourself into you're solidifying a certain aspect of yourself through your experience. So I suppose then people say, so what do we do about it? And the gentleman behind you asked me that in a way. Of course, that's a very, very big question. Partly it's the left hemisphere's question. Panic, there's a problem, we must fix it. What are the 8 bullet points that you can tell me that will solve the problem? And of course, I don't have 8 bullet points, and if I did, I wouldn't tell you what they were. Partly because everyone needs to think about this, take it away and digest it, and come up with their own solutions, which will be much better and more varied than the ones that I would give. We're all individuals, to quote a rather famous English film called The Life of Brian. I don't know if you remember this. The Brian figure, he's saying, you don't need to follow me. You don't need to follow anyone. You're all individuals. And they go, yes, we're all individuals. And then there's this one little bloke goes, wait a minute, I'm not. Anyway, but I think we've all got to sort of be different about it. But I think there are things we can do to be a little bit more serious. I mean, one would be we need to think about how we educate people. And at the moment, it's very technical and rigid and about shoving things into people rather than what education is about, which is about bringing things out of people and making them grow. And our education needs to prize the humanities much more, because it's through the humanities, through philosophy, through the history of people, through their literature, that you understand humanity and what we are and where we're going. If you don't really study these things, you can easily be seduced by the most naive philosophical positions, such as, lots of my colleagues have, that, well, quite clearly people are machines. Christ, can't they just do a little bit of philosophy before they start on their science courses or their medicine courses or whatever? So I think that would be one thing. But this is very much embedded in our culture. It's embedded in capitalism. It's embedded in the structure of bureaucracy, that everything has to be recorded and monitored and controlled. It's very hard to roll that back. I'll just take a short moment to explain something that I didn't explain, which was in the original title, about the Russian lieutenant. This is a reference to a story called Lieutenant Kizher by Tynyanov, a Russian writer in 1927, published this novel, which I believe was turned into an opera. And it's the story, it's obviously a satire on Soviet life, but it's carefully couched in terms of the Tsarist. It's set back in the Tsarist era. And it's about the transcription of the names of people in a platoon in the Russian army, in which somebody makes a mistake and invents, as it were, by mistake, the name of a lieutenant, who is called Lieutenant Kizher. And ever thereafter, this person can't be lost from the system because he's now there, and so on. And this lieutenant, although he doesn't exist, this doesn't impede him at all from having a stellar career. He is found to be a very reliable colleague. He's brave in action. He marries, has children, is promoted to rank of general. And finally, the Tsar wants to meet this paragon of virtue, but he can't be found anywhere. Meanwhile, a poor Lieutenant Sinyukhaev, who was missed off the list, is wandering around the highways of Russia with a begging bowl, trying to persuade people that although he's not on the list, he really does exist. He really is alive. Now, of course, that's marvelous, and it's a parody of the left hemisphere's way of doing things, but it's real. And when I wrote that, I incorporated that in a talk, I think. Somebody in America wrote to me and said, this is a true story. I have a friend who works, her brother worked in a mine, and there was a terrible mining accident. And the sister was rung up and told, your brother has died. So she went to the hospital, she went to the morgue, she looked at the body, and it was her brother. So she bent to kiss him. And she thought, that's funny. He's slightly warm for somebody who's been in the deep freeze. And she felt his pulse, and she thought, I think I can feel a very slow pulse. So she went over to the nurse who was standing by, because there always must be, obviously, an official presence. And she said, I think my brother might still be alive. To which the nurse uttered the immortal response, don't you worry about that, my dear. It says quite clearly on this piece of paper that he's dead. And she wasn't satisfied with this answer, so she ran out into the corridor, grabbed a passing doctor who came in, gave her brother intracardiac adrenaline, and he lived. So that was the story of the Russian lieutenant. Any more questions?
Yeah. I wonder if there is
Can you hold it rather close to your mouth? I'm terribly deaf.
I wonder if there is a difference in functions between the left and the right amygdala, and especially.
You want to say it in French, or?
Okay. Okay. Like that's the same, but okay. I wonder if there is a difference, in the functions that the left and the right amygdala are doing. Or?
Is there a difference between what the left and the right amygdala are doing?
Amygdala. There are a lot of differences between the left and right amygdala. Yes, indeed. And I say something about that in that book, and also in more about it in the book that I'm currently writing. But it doesn't neatly follow precisely the picture I was painting, because I was looking at the differences between the hemispheres overall. But there are important differences between left and right amygdala. What makes it quite complicated is that these differences are not necessarily the same in men and women. And sometimes where a man uses the right amygdala, the woman uses the left amygdala. And it usually seems to be that way round. In fact, I mean, I don't really want to get dragged into a conversation about this, but I put it to you as a scientific finding, that there are instances in which men and women process things differently, and in every case that I know of, and I footnoted about 35 of them in the book I'm writing, the difference is that where men use the right hemisphere, the women use the left. That surprises people, because a lot of people think somehow that the right hemisphere is more female and the left hemisphere more male. I kind of know what they're getting at, but it isn't true. Testosterone causes the right hemisphere to expand in the uterus, and the right hemisphere is larger than the left in males, but it is the same size as the left in females. And there are other physiological and anatomical differences, but they all point in the same direction. So that is a book I don't want to write. And those are questions I don't want to be grilled on now, because I won't be able to do justice to it and people will get excited and upset. So.
Thank you very much for this talk. Would you mind precising what you meant when you said in the Hall of Mirrors part that we are away from art and religion? Because it seems to me that art is pretty present in everyday life, and many people are believers. So.
He says that he thinks that art and religion are very much present in everyday life, and there are believers, and there is a lot of art around us. And so
yeah, good point. What I was, of course, you must understand that everything that I've said is sort of almost grotesquely abbreviated. So it's very much in order to fit things into an hour. But the point I was making about art is, and I think this is defensible, is that in our time, art has become unhelpfully cerebral. It has become about ideas a lot of the time, and has to be translated in order to have the point made. So very often you go to an art gallery and there's a screed on the wall about what the artist meant by doing this piece of work. Now, on the whole, as it were, Giorgione didn't write a screed about what he was doing when he was painting, you know? And I listen to radio, and there's a new performance commissioned by the BBC from a new composer. And before it happens, the composer comes on and talks for a quarter of an hour about what he was doing when he was writing. I don't mean making a cup of tea, what he was thinking about, you know, what he was intending, you know. And again, you know, Bach didn't say a damn thing about what he was doing, but it doesn't matter. So I think that we're dealing in art that works far too much at the explicit cerebral rationalistic left hemisphere level. It's dealing in sort of explicit things rather than the implicit. And the powerful art that I know, and there is some modern art that is, you can't say what it is that it's doing, but it hits you somewhere very powerful. So that is the distinction. About religion, my distinction was that I know England best. England has always been a bit apathetic about religion, really. But most people would say they don't belong to a religion. I mean, in England, I think 11% of the population say they belong to a religion. So it's not many. And in America, a lot more people say they belong to a religion, but unfortunately, they tend to belong to religions. I must be careful what I say, but there is a tendency to belong to religions that might be rather left hemisphere in their orientation, i.e. there is one truth, which is in this book, which is all very left hemisphere. It's the word, you know, that's written down, and that's right, and it's all about slightly improbable dogmas that you must believe, whereas you see, I think belief is not a matter of cognitive assumptions. It's not signing up to propositions. It's about having a disposition towards the world. And unfortunately, religion has become, for a lot of people in the present era, too much about, you must believe in this holy book, you must follow this set of rules. That's not what I think religion's about. And it's certainly not what I meant by helping us out of the left hemisphere hole that we've dug for ourselves.
Still quite a few.
Hello, can you hear me?
I can.
Thank you for your brilliant presentation and this book, which is magnificent. I'm involved in international affairs, and do you have, I've read, and I agree with so many things you've said, but because of this takeover, you could say, by mechanism, capitalism, control, the left hemisphere of the world right now, aggression, violence, do you have any hope that some of the greater values that you can say, you have said, are embedded in the right hemisphere, the values, the concepts, will be restored? There was a period about right after World War II when this was prevalent. Maybe it was in reaction to the horrors, but it's not present now. And I wonder if you have any solutions. And I think you should advise some of the leaders of the world.
Well, thank you. So far, I haven't received a text from Trump. Thank you for that. What do I think about whether there's hope? I call myself a hopeful pessimist, by which I mean, looking at it, it doesn't look good. But I have hope, because first of all, only a fool predicts the future. As Niels Bohr said, the physicist, prediction is very difficult, particularly about the future. And I find that too. So I think that it's wise not to jump to conclusions. Again, wherever I go and talk, I find a large body of young people who come up to me afterwards and say, that was so interesting, what can we do, how can I find out more, blah, 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 blah. So I think there's a hunger for thinking differently, yeah? So in a certain way, I'm pushing at an open door. And I think that things are changing, clearly. Yesterday, I was speaking at the Extinction Rebellion event in London, which is quite a major event. I mean, the whole of St. James's Park, which is proximate to government, was full of tents. I mean, the whole place. And peaceful demonstrations that were very moving. So people really are keen to do something different. The question is, have we got time? Of course, in time, things will change. In the past, things changed. After the collapse of the Roman Empire, it took 1,000 years for civilization to re-establish itself. We haven't got 1,000 years. We've barely got 5. You know, can we do things fast enough? And I think we can't, because we too much love, I love my comfortable life, you know? We'd have to change so radically, so fast. But it's not, nothing is ever all or nothing. The left hemisphere says it's all or nothing, it's black or white. I say no, nothing is ever all or nothing. So a lot may have to go, there may be terrible times, but they may actually be good for us, because I believe that adversity is an incredibly important aspect of human flourishing. Without adversity, one of the reasons we're in this mess is we've tried to abolish adversity altogether. But in fact, we don't flourish when there's no adversity. I'll tell you something fascinating I found recently. There are all these eco-domes, I don't know what you call them in French, but sort of environments that are enclosed, in which there's one called the Eden Project in the south of England, and they grow trees and things within protected environment. Yeah, and the people who run these were very puzzled by the fact that although the conditions were ideal, the trees kept falling over, and these were trees that had no predators or problems. But they fell over, and they discovered that the reason was they hadn't been stressed. They need to be exposed to wind in order to put down proper roots. Well, human beings are a bit like that, please remember. So there may be a very difficult time ahead, a very challenging time for all of us, particularly the younger people in this room, and I'm a grandfather, you know, so I really feel it. But we can win through, because human beings are fantastically resilient, and human beings are wonderful, actually. They're not these depraved apes that just want to kill one another. There is an aspect of humanity that is very competitive. That is true, but that's also good. But let me tell you this, there's another side of humanity that is even more important, which is that we're very cooperative. We wouldn't have got where we are without being cooperative. In fact, all species tend to help one another. Trees trying to help one another. It's not true that nature is all about enmity and aggression. Anyway, sorry, yeah. There are lots of other people who want to ask questions, so, yeah.
Yes, good evening. I would like to ask you about, at some point you talked about you made the big list of differences between the left and the right, and you put the known in the left hemisphere. Now, does that imply, I would tend to think no, but this is my question. Does that imply that memory belongs to the left hemisphere more? Of course not. But can you expand about that?
There are differences, gross differences generally between left hemisphere's memory and right hemisphere's memory, but memory is a hugely, diffuse thing, which, we used to talk about it just being in the hippocampus, but actually we now know that memory is very widely distributed, and it also makes sense to talk about things like muscle and gut and even bone as having memory of experience. So, but certainly the central nervous system throughout has memory. And what I think I would say is that the things that are more factual and abstracted from context are probably better dealt with by the left hemisphere. Those that are harder to pigeonhole, summarize, and ramify into complex lived contexts, certain kinds of emotional or autobiographical memory are perhaps better dealt with by the right hemisphere. But of course we need degrees of certainty. We need degrees of everything. We need degrees of both of these things all the time. The difference is that the left hemisphere thinks we only need one. The right hemisphere knows we need both. And that's a crucial difference, because we need either or, and we need both and. So we need both either or and both and. We don't need either or both and, which would be the left hemisphere's view. I hope that's completely clear. And this is behind the myth of the master and his emissary. The story is effectively of a wise spiritual master who realizes that he can't deal with everything, not just because he's limited, because in fact it would be much better if he didn't get involved in certain things if he is to keep the broad perspective. And so he delegates his brightest to go about and do certain kinds of activity for the good of the community. But that bright person, although bright, doesn't know what it is he doesn't know, and therefore thinks, I'm the one that knows everything, I'm the master. And that's where we are now. The left hemisphere thinks it's the master. Now, there's something in psychology called the Dunning-Kruger effect. And effectively what this means is the more you know, the more you realize how little you know. And the people who think they know everything know next to nothing. And I can think of some prominent examples. We've got time for just a few more, I don't know, but I'm not in charge of this.
Hi, in the middle here. I was wondering if you could comment on in your sort of left-right brain terms, the effect that social media or overuse of social media might be having on our brains and our behavior.
Well, I'll try and keep it very brief, but you can imagine I'm not a fan. I don't do it. I call it anti-social media. I think that it's damaging in a whole lot of ways. Speaking as a psychiatrist, it hasn't increased people's well-being. It's made them feel insecure. It's made them feel distanced. It's made them more competitive, made them more anxious. I think it's distracting. The only important things in life come from prolonged, slow, deep thought. And creating spaces in which you can have that is very important. But if you're looking at your phone every few minutes, not a chance that you will live before you die. So switch the bugger off. There's some ladies here as well who need to have a go, but yeah.
All right, thank you very much for your talk. I agree with everything you're saying, but I am going to ask
that was unwise.
A little bit of a controversial question.
Okay.
You have described a world led by the left hemisphere, something unwanted, which I'm not saying is not. But over the past few years, we have achieved the greatest productivity, we have increased the quality of life, we have expanded as a species, which you could say that as animals, survival is one of our biggest goals. So who is to say that the world led by the left hemisphere, and perhaps letting it play on and follow the cycles that we have had in the past, is not the best path to go, if so far we have achieved great advances with it?
Okay, I'm going to have to be quick. I don't agree that we have improved the quality of life. It depends what you mean by the quality of life, and it depends what you mean by life. Obviously, in certain very practical ways, we are more comfortable. We can conquer diseases. But actually, if you look at human happiness, we were slightly happier 50 years ago when we didn't have, most people didn't have many of the things we now have. And our expansion as a species has been at colossal, unimaginable cost to every other aspect of the earth, every other living thing, and its beauty, which is very important to us. So that's all I'd say.
Yes, I'll be very brief. You mentioned reification and pigeonholing as characteristics of how the left hemisphere processes things. And I hope I'm not too hold down by my own experience, but my whole life I'm from Venezuela, which is of course an authoritarian, heavily ideological state. I have struggled to comprehend how people who are dogmatic ideologists, who try to think they can control everything within their ideology, struggle to grasp reality, both when that ideology is in service of the state, and both here, for example, abroad, when people who confronted with a very human, a very tragic, a very real experience that I've known personally, say, well, no, because that doesn't fit into my ideology. You don't have class conscience, you're a bourgeois, you are... So is there a connection between how the left hemisphere's dominance and dogmatic ideology?
Is the Pope a Catholic? There is. And people who are thinking in this way tend to be certain that they're right. They tend to be dogmatic. They tend not to see individuals but categories. They tend to be cut off from feeling. They tend to schematize. And they can be very dismissive. Only somebody who is only partially attuned at all to other human beings can be so rigid and lacking in compassion as so many ideologues are.
Thank you.
Perhaps two more questions. Is that okay?
Hi. Thank you so much. I wanted to ask you about how depression and anxiety affect the hemispheres and how they work.
Oh, lovely. Not a brief one, I'm afraid, but let me do my best. Quick and dirty answer is anxiety doesn't relate so specifically generally to one or other hemisphere, but it's a lot of anxiety disorders are exacerbated by left hemisphere overdrive, if you like, because it's about control. And a lot of my patients, one of the things that was central to their problem was their belief that they ought to be in control or that they had lost control. And I was able to reassure them by pointing out that there was not a snowball's chance in hell that they could ever be in control of anything. They never had been in control. They never will be in control. Now start enjoying life by moving with the flow, going with the Tao, but not sitting there going, it's got to be like this, in which case, of course, you will live a very anxious life. Depression is very interesting from this point of view. Effectively, depression tends to be an imbalance in which whatever should counterbalance the right frontal cortex, which is very empathic, is not working properly. So, if you like, there's an overemphasis on what the right hemisphere's frontal cortex sees. It sees suffering, it feels suffering, it feels connection. It tends to view even itself in a slightly negative way. So, although that is really a very important part of being a human being, it does need to be counterbalanced. And when people are treated for depression, you can see the left frontal activity becoming more prominent and balancing it a bit. Now, there are two ways in which this can happen, because there are two things that very crudely balance the right frontal cortex. One is the left frontal cortex, obviously. The other is the right posterior cortex, because I haven't talked about this, but the anterior and posterior cortex of the same hemisphere balance one another. So if people have, for example, a stroke in the right posterior cortex, that can mean, again, an overactivity in the right frontal cortex. And these two kinds have different qualities. So when the right posterior cortex is hypoactive, and that's the cause, then the patient has a kind of moribund quality, is hardly alive, is kind of like the living dead. But when the left frontal lobe is the problem, and the right hemisphere as a whole is perfectly active, then they have agitated depression, because they're still alive, but they don't know how they can be alive or how to deal with being alive. It would make a very good, at least hour or two talk, but that's it in brief.
Thank you so much.
There was somebody over here.
If I may, here in the center. Thanks a lot. My question was about, like, you talked about how the brain is plastic, and so it sort of adapts and changes. So if you could elaborate a bit more on these two-way relations. It seems that, society and what we have around us changes the brain, but at the same time, the way in which our brains function shapes society. So could you elaborate a bit on how this relation plays out?
I mean, I think I've made the point that this exists. I mean, I can talk about it at the technical level in terms of kindling and reinforcement of certain circuitry, but that's perhaps not what you want. I think my answer would be perhaps to read the book. Because in the second half of the book, I talk about how culture and the brain interact. And it's really too vast a question, yeah.
We'll conclude with that.
Yeah, well, it's really up to you. Yeah.
Okay, so I'll be brief. My question's a little bit different. It's related to what you were talking about in the beginning, where you said that we can't learn and appreciate literature as such if we categorize it, because it loses some of its essence. And it's interesting because when I was doing my bachelor's, I studied psychology and literature. So I would like to ask you, because I know that we categorize literature and try and really dissect the plays and the books that we read. How would you teach it then?
How would I?
Yeah, how would you propose, or what would be a good way to teach literature to students?
Well, it would be something like the way I suppose I was taught, which was very good, which was very human. I'm not against all kinds of categorization, of course. It's one of the ways in which we understand anything, is to say it's like other things. And to see similarities is important, but to see differences is also very important. And you can get carried away with the stream of this is Augustan, or this is romantic, or this is whatever, and not see the really crucial aspect of this particular person, this particular poem that is very special, and you need to attend to it. I suppose, I'm going to have to wind up now, so this is the last thing I'll say. I think that one of the things we need to do is to listen. And I don't mean just listen to others talking, but that's very important, but to listen to what everything is saying to us, what nature is saying to us, what works of art are saying to us, not to be too quick to dive in with our clever ideas. Too much criticism is to do with, I've had a bright idea, in which you actually get between the listener, the viewer, and the work of art, showing off, instead of getting out of the way. The work of a critic is to clear things away, like Michelangelo clearing the marble away, so that suddenly there's a living human being. Thank you. Thank you very much.